We all have been quite familiar with the term epidemic in the past 2 years. I think we'd agree. My kids are like amateur virologists at this point. But I think that there's a more subtle, pervasive, dangerous epidemic that started long before COVID-19 and will continue long after. And that's the epidemic of loneliness. Research suggests that chronic loneliness is as dangerous as up to smoking 15 cigarettes a day because of the impact that it has on your heart, on your mind, on your mental health, your immunity, your cognitive functioning. Depression is up 30% around the world. People feel incredibly lonely. Studies are showing us loneliness is literally killing us. It's because we're made for connection. We're made for relationship with one another and ultimately with the one who made us. It was John Piper who said, "The deepest longing of the human soul is to know and enjoy the glory of God." We were made for this. And so I would contend that our problem is not necessarily the problem that we're so often facing, but it's the fact that we feel invisible in the midst of the struggle. And today I want to tell you about a story of a woman who felt invisible, but who changed the course of history and certainly the course of her own life because she met the God who sees her. I want to tell you the story of Hagar. And the title of my sermon today is Seeing is Sometimes Believing. So here's the big idea. God sees us, and when we live with the awareness of his sovereign gaze on us, we can live brave and free and wholeheartedly for others. So let's read from Genesis 16, from the NIV. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, 'You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me.' 'Your slave is in your hands,' Abram said. 'Do with her whatever you think is best.' Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going?' 'I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai,' she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, 'Go back to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel added, 'I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count.' The angel of the Lord also said to her, 'You're now pregnant, and you'll give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers.' She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. 'You're the God who sees me,' she said. 'I have now seen the one who sees me.' That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It's still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she'd born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael." So a bit of background. This is Genesis 16. In Genesis 15, God makes one of his covenants through Abraham that his offspring would be more than all the stars in the sky. And Abram believed him, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then 10 years passed, and still no baby, right? So they are feeling a little bit like, okay, maybe it was like one of those, we got to help out God a bit. Okay, let's take matters into our own hands. Let's make a plan. Let's get Hagar involved here. It's a little bit tough for our 21st century sensibilities to accept this, but this was a practice to kind of perpetuate the family name back then. When the wife was unable to bear children, it was an acceptable practice to get another lady involved. And she was a property of Sarai. She was her maidservant. Now, this was something that we, obviously in this day and age, it's not something that we would advocate for. But we actually just need to see this in terms of God putting his redemptive heart on display and coming into a space and bringing redemption, as he does time and time again for women in this day and age. And so she had no rights. She was a slave. She was mistreated. She succumbed to huge cruelty, and she ran. She fled, understandably. She ran from that place of her pain. And the angel, it says, came, and what did he do? He found her. He found her. He found the exact GPS location where she was, at the well, along the road to Shur. Why did they give those details? I just think it was because God wants to tell us that he's very, very specific in his love for us. He sees to the minutia, to the smallest detail of where we are, where we're at. And he came and he met her there. He initiated the exchange. And what is the first word that he speaks? He says, Hagar. And if you notice, before that, it was always my maidservant, my slave. The way that Abram and Sarai spoke about her was they never called her by name. She was property. But God calls her first on her name. He doesn't take away her status, but he preempts it with a comma. He says, Hagar, comma, servant of Sarai. He's saying to her, before you're anything else, I know you. I chose you. I see you. You're mine. And he probes her. He asks her two questions. He says, Hagar, where are you coming from? And where are you going? He speaks of her past and he speaks of her future. So she can easily answer the first one, but not so much the second. She knows she's running. Her name, Hagar, actually means to run. It means to flee. So she was just doing what her name means. She was identifying with this cruelty and this harshness and this pain, and she was out of that space. She was running from that sense of fear and unworthiness. She doesn't really know where she's running to, and God surely knows that. If anything, her only plan was suicide, because the conditions in the desert were really tough. There was not a great chance that she would have survived it there. Between the wild animals and the weather conditions and the lack of food, she probably would have died in the desert. But why would he ask that? Because he's God. I mean, the angel knew the answer to that. I think he was just trying to get to her heart, you know? So often, he probes us, not because he doesn't know, but because he wants us to just come bare, just come as we are, with nothing else, stripped, with no T's and C's applying, just no pretense, no religion. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to the cross I cling. Tim Keller says, to be loved but not known is comforting, but it's superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. It liberates us from pretense, humbles us out of our self-righteousness, and fortifies us for any difficulty life can throw at us. I love that God is a God of authenticity, and the only condition that he has is that we come bare, empty-handed. I love that God sees us as he saw Hagar, but he didn't just leave her there either. He sees where she's going to. She's unable to answer the second question. Where are you going to, Hagar? That is for God to determine. That's his department. We can say where we're coming from, but God determines our future. He tells us where we're going to. But it's interesting to get to where she's going. What does he say? He says, you got to go back. Now, if I were God, I'd be like, no, let's get a different plan. I'll make a portal, shoot you out of here, or I don't know, have a handsome Bedouin guy on a camel come over the hill and rescue you. I think that'd be the equivalent of a white horse back then. But he didn't do that. He said, I want you to go back to the place of your suffering. Submit to her, he says. Go back to your mistress. It's a command. And we don't like commands by God. We like the idea of healing, but sometimes we don't like the conditions of our healing. But more often the promise for restoration and blessing, it's fulfilled in the place of our exile. It's a place where we feel most alienated. It's a place where we feel most alone, most out of sorts. I think I've shared this before, but I'll share it again for illustration's sake. But when I came over 22 years ago to Botswana, and I was very much in exile. I was very naive and very much off the boat, and I was very alone. And were not great conditions. It was, all I had was a calling card that I couldn't afford to use. And it was long before cell phones. I was so alone. And yet I knew that there was someone beside me every night. Just stayed. He just stayed there. Just the presence of God was there. I didn't know God, but I knew God was there. I didn't need him actually to even change my circumstances. I just needed him to be there with me in it. And he was. And Hagar, it's the same way. Her exile was not in the desert. Her exile was in the household. Her exile was there with Abram and Sarai, where she felt it was most out of place. It was a chafing place. It hurt, it burned, it chiseled away at her dignity. And yet God said, that's where I need you to submit. Trust me in the process. Can we trust God in the process of our healing? Can we go to those places sometimes we don't want to go back to? Can we trust that God will be there with us in it? He won't leave us, that he'll stay with us, and he'll bring us through it. He will heal us, and he will bless us. He promised to bless Hagar. It wasn't just for the sake of going back. It was the sake of going back to go forward. He said, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Starting now, you are now pregnant. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he'll live in hostility towards all his brothers. Okay, wait. I'm sorry, but that doesn't sound like a great promise to me. Like if I was at my baby shower and my kids were like, someone were to say to me, you are going to have this real donkey of a child. There we go. He's going to be the terrible twos for the rest of his life, He's just going to be a nightmare. It's going to be awesome. You're going to love it, That to me it doesn't sound like a wonderful, exciting promise. And yet her response was worship. So how do we make sense of that? But what I realized in my study is that the wild donkey of a man was a metaphor back then. It was a cultural metaphor for a wild stallion. It was an image of freedom. And what God was saying through that, even as he said, your hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, it was part of a metaphor to say, he will be free. He will not succumb to the bondage of men. He will not be a slave as you are in your generation. I'm going to break this. I'm going to break the bonds of slavery. Physically, circumstantially, this is the end. And so that's why she could turn and worship him. She could rejoice, and she could ultimately obey. It was a wonderful promise to her. But she didn't just get the promise of physical freedom that day. That was the gift of salvation to her. As Adrian said, she heard the voice of God, and in that she saw him. She got the gift of spiritual freedom in that day. It was the day of her salvation. And from that, she could live brave and free. When she heard her name spoken and her identity confirmed over her, when she knew who she was, she found her voice. See, the first time she spoke, it was from a place of brokenness. It was identifying with her pain. But when she speaks again, she's identifying with her future. When you see God, when he speaks to you, when he confirms your value, who you are in him, you suddenly have a voice, and you can speak into your future. And she names God. She names him El Roy. In the original Hebrew, that's translated as shepherd. So it's not just seeing, it's gazing. It's looking into. It's looking with the kindness of a shepherd who's ultimately, absolutely concerned with the state of his sheep. It's a never turning away, eyes on you, I'm going with you to the end kind of gazing. And she's the only person in the Bible who gives God a name. Don't you just love that? I love the fact that God allowed a slave girl to name him. Very different than how we do things, right? I mean, we're looking for our influencers in social media. We're looking for the compliments of our colleagues. We're looking for a great testimony that somehow positions us as pretty awesome, but all be glory to God, you know? We're looking for someone else to endorse us all the time because we need to. But God doesn't need any endorsing from any man. He doesn't need endorsing from anyone. And I just love the fact that he chose a young slave to endorse him, to name him. It says in 1 Corinthians 1, but God chose those whom the world considers foolish to shame those who think they're wise. And God chose the puny and the powerless to shame the high and mighty. He chose the lowly, the laughable in the world's eyes, nobodies, so that he would shame the somebodies. She not only names him, but he gives her the dignity to name her offspring. And he says, name him Ishmael, which means God sees. Shama means see, God sees. And that speaks to me of intimacy, because it's the combination of I see and I hear. You need both for intimacy. You need both for proximity. And I know, because I know as a mom, I could be at the table, I'm with the kids, and what do they say? Mom, could you just look at me for a sec? Could you just look at me? And I'm here on my laptop, and just look. I'm not fully there. I need to look at them. And when you hear, you can step away, and I'm like, I hear you, but you don't actually hear. You need both. God speaks about us being the apple of his eye. That apple is the pupil of your eye. That's how up close and personal he is. And how brave and how intimate is it that she opened her voice and she spoke the name of God and the name of her son over her future and over her destiny. She went from being a victim to being a front-footed, brave woman. She was able to face her fears, and she was able to go back to the place of her pain. Why? Because God didn't call her actually on her name. It wasn't just the fact that he called her Hagar and acknowledged her for who she was. He actually renamed her in the process. Because if her name means flee, he said, your name might mean to flee. You go stay. I'm going to rename you. I'm going to redefine you. You're more than that. You go stay. Go back there and stay. And you will not be defined by your fear. You'll be defined by my strength. I will make you free from the inside as well. You may go back as a slave, but you can live free. You can live free in that space. Can we be others who help people to live free? Our job isn't necessarily to rescue them from their circumstances, but to help them stand in the storms. And I've got a friend in Pretoria. Her name is Nicola, and she's a real bulldog when it comes to things of injustice. And I love that about her. She introduced us to a man named Hard Life. That was his name, Hard Life. And he had a brother. His brother's name was Hard Life. Yeah, they were both named Hard Life. So imagine the dinner conversations. Hard Life, yeah, Hard Life, Hard Life, Hard Life. It's not really conducive for a good, affirming, kind of conversation around the table. And Hard Life had a hard life. Funny that. He worked for our friend. He was in construction, and one day he got his arm caught in a compressor, and it was cut off. And he lost his right arm. He lost his right arm. And we asked him to do a paint job for us. a little while, maybe a couple months later, because now he's a painter all of a sudden. And he carries the paint in the crook of his arm here, and he just paints forever with his left arm. It's quite amazing. We said to him, how long hard life didn't help? Did you have to make the adjustment from being a right-handed guy to a left-handed guy? And he said, about 20 minutes. So he's quite a resilient guy. But he did have a hard life, and that's him. That's hard life. But Nicholas said, you know what? We're going to rename you. We're going to call you Blessing. And we just said, yeah, that's right. We're going to rename you. And she got involved there. And she got a lawyer involved because it was an unfortunate circumstance. The boss wasn't really interested in helping with any compensation, but she got in there. And for 2 years, she paid for lawyer fees, and she fought for Blessing. And she met with him every week, and she'd meet him. He became a car guard. She'd meet him at the parking lot, and they would chat and talk about what's going on now. And nobody had hope for this situation to change, for him to get. Everybody said, you won't get your money out. It's not going to happen. He's a foreigner. He got his money out one day, and he was compensated for it. And it's not the fact, the blessing is not necessarily in the fact that he got the money out, although that was a great bonus. But it was the fact that somebody renamed him, and somebody saw him. It was the fact that he got a community around him, and we did things for him, and we got a solar fridge for him because he lived in Plastic View where there was no electricity, and we loved on his kids, and you could see this man became so free. And when you saw him, he had the biggest smile on his face, and you could see he had a hard life, but he lived free and blessed in the midst of his troubles. And I feel like God is asking us in this season, will we turn hard lives into blessings in other people's lives? Will we have the courage to rename people? Will we speak destiny and dignity over people? What I love is that Nicholas stopped long enough to hear his story, to ask the question, where do you come from? To ask his story. What is your story? Where do you come from? But she ring-fenced his past. She didn't let it define him. She asked the more important question, where are you going to? And you know what? Most of the time, people don't know, but we can help answer that question with them. And hard life still is a really, really hard life today. His house, I think, is burned down twice, and it's just been difficult for him, but he lives so free. And maybe you feel like hard life or Hagar today, running away from pain, or maybe you're hiding behind success, or things have happened, you're hiding in the wilderness of your career, you're maybe broken, you may be given up. But God wants to say, I see you. I know your name. I see who you are, and I see who you will be. I feel like God is asking us, are you willing to see people, like really see people? Because I don't think that we all know the biggest problem in our world, it's not a resource deficit, it's a compassion deficit. It's a grace deficit. And we can fill that as the church. I want to be part of a church where nobody feels invisible, where everybody's name is known. Antoinette, praiseworthy. Lenka, light. Jason, healer. Luther, you're coming. Luther, warrior. Megan, pearl. Alex, healer. Haida, noble one. That we know one another. That we can rename people with God-given destinies on their lives. Because the fact is, we actually, even if we don't feel like we're in some season where we're in the desert, we're all Hagars. We're all spiritually Hagars. We're all sinners. Romans 6:18 says, you have been set free from sin and you've become slaves to righteousness. But we all come from a place of sin. And we're all in exile. We're all far from home. And I want to end on that note. You know, in Jeremiah 29, we all know the quote. We love it. I know the plans I have for you. They're plans to prosper you, not to harm you. They're plans to give you hope and a future. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But do we know that promise was given in a time of exile? It was a 70-year prior promise. And God said the prerequisite to that promise, just kind of settle down, settle in, be a part of that place, be a part of the exile. Bless it, have kids, grow your crops, enjoy, and look and seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And so long as we're called here to Stellenbosch, our well-being is wrapped up in the everyday, ordinary people we see. The people at the till, the people in our workplace, people on the side of the road, the people here. There are stories, and there are people who really desperately need to know that they are seen. Let's move in like God did. Let's find people. Let's move into that space. Let's move in prayer, because that's ultimately where we'll pick up the heart for people and be able to see something of their futures. But let's take those steps towards others. And then as God leads, let's be the church that the world is waiting to see. Let's go and make the invisible God visible to Stellenbosch.